The water did not look like salvation. It looked like mud and trampled earth, a silver coin of light winking from the bottom of a wide, messy hollow. But the wagons came anyway, a slow, dusty procession snaking up the rise to Elspeth's land, the land everyone had called Thorn's Folly, and then, when she bought it, the widow's waste. The creak of axles and the lowing of thirsty cattle were the only sounds that dared challenge the vast, heat-hammered silence of the sky. Men who had laughed at her in the street now stood holding their hats, their eyes fixed on the miracle her hogs had made. They watched her, a woman alone with rough hands and a stillness that had been forged in mockery, and they waited. They waited for her judgment, for her price, for the turn of her head that would mean the difference between ruin and survival. What they did not yet know was that the judgment had been passed months ago, not by her, but by the land itself. 8 months earlier, the judgment of the town had been just as clear and far less kind. It was the tail end of a hard winter, the air still holding a knife's edge, when Miller Blackwood's farm went under the hammer. Elspeth stood at the back of the crowd, a ghost in a worn gray shawl, listening to the auctioneer, Silas Thorne, parcel out a man's life in lots. Thorne was a man whose warmth was a tool, like a saw or a spade, used to shape the world to his liking. He sold the plow, the house, the good bottomland that ran along the creek. Then, last of all, came the hogs. "Lot 107, Thorne called out, his voice smooth as butter. 80 head of Miller's finest swine, a bit lean from the winter, but with good spring pasture, they'll fatten right up for you." A bitter laugh rippled through the crowd. Miller's hogs were not lean. They were specters, walking skeletons of pink skin stretched over bone, their snouts caked with the frozen mud they'd been trying to eat for want of anything else. They huddled in a makeshift pen, a miserable, shivering mass of despair. No one with sense would take them on. They were a walking debt, a barrel of grain per head just to get them through to grass. Grain no one had to spare. "Who'll start the bidding?" Thorne boomed, his smile unwavering. Silence. The wind whistled through the bare branches of the cottonwoods. "Come now, gentlemen, a fine start to a new herd." "They're half dead, Silas," a voice called from the crowd. "Cost more to bury 'em than to buy 'em." Thorne's smile tightened. "An investment, then, for the man with vision." He scanned the faces, his eyes skipping right over Elspeth as if she were a fence post. He was looking for a fool. His gaze found no takers. The farmers, their faces chapped and grim, shook their heads. They knew the arithmetic of survival. Those hogs were a subtraction, not an addition. $25 for the lot, a voice said, quiet but clear. Every head turned. It was Elspeth. She stood with her hands clasped, her chin lifted just enough to meet the sudden, unified stare of the town. A murmur went through the men. $25 was her entire savings, the last of the money her husband had left her, painstakingly hoarded from mending and washing. Silas Thorne blinked, his professional warmth curdling into something like pitying disbelief. He looked at her, at the thinness of her frame and the stubborn set of her jaw. "The young widow bids $25, he said, pitching his voice so everyone could appreciate the absurdity. $25 for 80 starving hogs. A woman alone. Does anyone see a better offer?" He paused for effect, letting the silence hang. "Going once? Going twice?" His eyes met hers, a flicker of condescending amusement in them. "Sold, to the widow, for $25. May God have mercy on your pantry." The laughter that followed was not cruel, not exactly. It was the weary, knowing laughter of people who understood the unforgiving calculus of the land. It was the sound of her own foolishness being confirmed by a jury of her peers. She paid her money, her hand steady as she counted out the worn coins, and did not meet Thorne's gaze. She had just bought 80 mouths to feed with nothing but a patch of worthless, clay-choked high ground to her name. The arithmetic was simple. She was ruined. The journey from the auction yard to her two-room cabin was a slow, shambling tragedy. The Hogs, weak and disoriented, moved with the listless shuffle of creatures who had forgotten the purpose of walking. Elspeth walked behind them, a long switch in her hand, not to strike them but to tap their bony rumps, to urge them onward, to remind them that there was a forward, even if it led nowhere good. The men who had been at the auction watched from their fields as she passed, a solitary woman herding a flock of rattling bones up the rutted track toward the scrub-choked acres everyone knew wouldn't grow decent weeds. They shook their heads and went back to their work, the brief entertainment of her folly already fading. Her land was a 15-acre insult, high ground the color of rust, studded with rocks and thistle. The cabin was sound enough, but the land itself was a promise of failure. It had no well, only a temperamental cistern that caught the rain, and the soil was a thin, grudging skin over a skeleton of hard-pan clay. It was all she'd been able to afford. Now, it was home to 80 starving animals. That first night, as a cold wind moaned under the eaves, she sat at her small table and did the arithmetic. 80 hogs. She had a sack of cornmeal, half a bushel of withered potatoes, and the wild onions she could dig from the creek bank 2 miles away. It was food for her for a month, perhaps. For the hogs, it was not even a single meal. She felt a cold knot of panic tighten in her chest. Silas Thorne's voice echoed in her head. A woman alone. It was not meant as an observation. It was meant as a verdict. She rose and went to the door, looking out at the miserable shapes huddled against the lee of the cabin. They were not moving. They were simply enduring. For the first time since her husband's passing, she felt the sheer, crushing weight of being solitary, of having no one to turn to, no one to share the burden of a terrible mistake. But then she saw one of the hogs, a sow with ribs like a washboard, lift her head and test the wind with a long, trembling snout. It was a gesture of such profound, instinctual hope, a belief in a future that contained something other than mud and misery, that it shamed Elspeth's despair. She had made a bargain. She would keep it. The next morning, she was up before the sun, a bucket in each hand. She did not walk toward the town, but away from it, toward the wooded hills. She spent the day foraging, her hands growing raw as she dug for cattail roots in the icy mud of a marsh, stripped the inner bark from slippery elms, and gathered acorns the squirrels had missed. She came back at dusk, her body aching, with 2 buckets of what could generously be called food. She boiled it all into a thin, steaming slurry in a great iron pot over an outdoor fire. The smell was earthy and bitter. The hogs, drawn by the scent, crowded around, their weak grunts a chorus of desperate need. She poured the mash into long, makeshift troughs she'd fashioned from hollowed logs. They fell upon it, their snouts pushing and shoving, the sound of their slurping both pathetic and vital. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But it was something. It was a start. Day after day, this became her rhythm. Rise in the dark, forage, haul, boil, feed. She learned the landscape in a way she never had before, not as scenery, but as a larder. She learned which roots were edible, which fungi were safe, which barks held sustenance. The townsfolk saw her sometimes, far in the distance, a small figure bent to the earth, and they pitied her. They saw her devotion to a lost cause, the foolish tenderness she was squandering on animals already marked for death. They were watching a slow-motion failure. and it reaffirmed everything they knew about the world. After a week of this back-breaking labor, Elspeth felt a weariness sink into her bones. The hogs were no longer losing weight, but they were not gaining it either. She was holding starvation at bay by a thread, and the thread was her own diminishing strength. One evening, as she stirred the bubbling pot, a figure appeared at the edge of her property. It was a woman, old and stooped, with a scarf tied over her head, and a face as wrinkled as a dried apple. It was Anya Petrova, who lived in a small cottage on the other side of the ridge, a woman the town treated with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They said she was from the old country, that she spoke to plants, that she knew things best left unknown. Mrs. Petrova stood for a long moment, her dark eyes taking in the scene, the cabin, the fire, the pathetic congregation of hogs. She did not laugh. She did not pity. She simply watched. Elspeth stopped stirring, her hand tightening on the wooden paddle. She waited for the judgment. "It is hard work to fill a hungry belly," Mrs. Petrova said. Her voice was accented, thick but gentle. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. "It is," Elspeth agreed, her own voice tight. "They say you are a fool," the old woman continued, taking a slow step forward. "They say you have thrown your money into a pit. They are probably right." Mrs. Petrova shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "The land knows its own business," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, aphoristic cadence. "People are loud. They shout what they think. But the land? It only whispers. You only have to learn how to listen." She came closer and peered into the steaming pot. "Cattail, acorn. Good, but not enough. The hog is a root finder. It has a nose for what is hidden. You are giving them what you can find. You must let them find what they were made to." She pointed with a gnarled finger toward the far end of Elspeth's property, a shallow basin where the clay was thickest and nothing grew but a few stunted, thorny bushes. "That place. The ground is hard, too hard for a plow, but it holds the damp. Take them there. Let them work." Elspeth looked at the basin. It was the most useless part of her useless land. "There's nothing there." "There is always something," Mrs. Petrova said with certainty. "You have fed their bellies. Now, you must feed their nature." She reached into a deep pocket in her apron and pulled out a handful of something that looked like dried, lumpy roots. "Burdock," she said. "Tough, deep. The hogs will smell it. It will teach them where to look." She pressed them into Elspeth's hand. Her skin was dry as paper. "Do not listen to the town. Listen to the pigs." And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the twilight as quietly as she had arrived. That night, Elspeth did the arithmetic again, but this time, a new variable had been added. It was not hope, exactly. It was a possibility, a different way of seeing the problem. The next morning, she scattered the dried burdock roots near the basin. Then, instead of penning the hogs, she let them wander. They were stronger now, a little, and they moved with more purpose. They milled around the yard, their snouts to the ground, and then, one by one, they began to drift toward the shallow basin, drawn by a scent only they could perceive. They began to root. At first it was tentative, but then, with growing excitement, they tore at the hard-packed clay, their powerful snouts acting as living plows, turning over the soil that had resisted all of Elspeth's own efforts. By the end of the third week, a change was visible. The hogs, driven by the instinct Mrs. Petrova had trusted, had turned over nearly half the basin. They were finding things to eat, deep tubers, grubs, the starchy roots of the stubborn bushes, and for the first time, a thin layer of flesh began to pad their ribs. They were no longer skeletons. They were becoming proper pigs. Their work had a side effect Elspeth hadn't anticipated. They were tilling the land. The hard-pan clay, broken up and mixed with their manure, was slowly, miraculously, turning into soil. Her work had not lessened, but it had changed. She still foraged, but now she was supplementing their diet, not providing it entirely. Her new task was managing their work, fencing off areas she wanted cleared, moving them to new patches when they had exhausted an old one. She had found a partner in her animals. She was not a woman alone with 80 starving mouths. She was a woman with 80 unpaid, tireless farmhands. It was around this time that the boy appeared. His name was Finn, a rail-thin child of about 10 from a hard-luck family at the edge of town. He was quiet and watchful, with eyes that seemed to see everything. He started by just standing at the property line, observing the strange, symbiotic dance between the woman and her herd. Elspeth, remembering the sting of being watched and judged, simply nodded at him each day and went about her work. One afternoon, as she was hauling water, he spoke. "That one's the boss," he said, pointing a skinny finger at a large sow with a black spot over one eye. "She always eats first." Elspeth stopped and looked. The boy was right. The sow, whom she hadn't distinguished from the others, had a clear authority about her. "She needs a name, then," Elspeth said. "What should we call her?" Finn considered this with the gravity of a theologian. "Queenie," he said at last, and so she was Queenie. The next day Finn was back, and he named another. A big, placid boar became general for his calm demeanor in the face of chaos. A small, quick-moving gilt was named Drought. Soon, Finn was a daily presence, arriving after his chores at home were done. He never asked for anything. He just helped. He hauled wood for the fire, patched the crude fencing, and kept the official tally of names, which soon included every single hog. There was Patches, and Mudpie, and Snuffles, and Sir Oink. The gentle, situational irony of a child giving dignified names to a flock of what the town considered garbage was not lost on Elspeth. The work was still hard, but the loneliness had eased. Finn's quiet companionship was a balm. His belief in the hogs, his unironic love for them, helped to shore up her own flagging resolve. He saw them not as a bad investment, but as 80 distinct, hard-working individuals. He was the first person, other than Mrs. Petrova, who looked at what she was doing and saw sense instead of madness. The hogs continued their work in the basin. They seemed drawn to the very lowest point, a spot where the clay was particularly dense and cool. They worked this spot with a frantic, obsessive energy that was different from their usual rooting. Elspeth watched them, a prickle of curiosity on her skin. They were trying to tell her something. The land, as Anya Petrova had said, was whispering. By June, the days had grown long and warm. The hogs, now sleek and fat, had completely overturned the shallow basin, transforming it into a landscape of churned, fertile earth. But they remained fixated on that one low spot, digging deeper and deeper, their grunts echoing with a strange urgency. Elspeth had tried to fence them away from it, to move them on, but they were relentless, breaking through her makeshift barriers to return to their excavation. One afternoon, a stillness fell over the herd. They stood in a wide circle around the hole they had dug, now several feet deep, their snouts pointed toward it, silent and watchful. It was an unnerving sight. Puzzled, Elspeth picked up a shovel and walked into the basin. The air near the hole felt cooler, heavier. She peered in. The bottom was dark, damp clay. Nothing more. But the hog's expectant silence was a kind of command. Trusting them, trusting the instinct that had brought her this far, she slid into the hole. The earth was cool against her boots. She drove the shovel into the bottom. It sank with a thick, sucking sound. She heaved the heavy clay out, again and again. On the fifth shovelful, something changed. The shovel met less resistance. When she pulled it free, a small, dark patch remained at the bottom of the hole. Water. It was just a seep, a tiny puddle welling up from below, but it was unmistakably water. She stared at it, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She dug again, widening the hole, and the seep grew, the water pooling faster than the thirsty clay could absorb it. It was cold. Colder than any rainwater, colder than the water from the town creek. It was deep earth water, a spring. The Hogs had found a spring. She scrambled out of the hole and stood, muddy and breathing hard, looking at the miracle they had unearthed. A secret, living pulse deep within her worthless land. The Hogs seemed to sigh, their work done, and began to wander off in search of shade. Elspeth knelt by the edge of the growing pool, dipping her hand in. The water was clean and sweet. She laughed, a raw, rusty sound she hadn't made in years. It had worked. All of it. The foolish purchase, the back-breaking labor, the trust in an old woman's words and an animal's instinct. It had all led to this. Her first thought was not of triumph, but of secrecy. This was a treasure too precious to be shared. The town that had mocked her would not be allowed to celebrate with her. She would bank this discovery like a coal kept low under ash, saving its heat for when she truly needed it. With Finn's help, she spent the next week fencing off the basin, planting a thick screen of fast-growing gourds and squash on the newly fertile soil to hide it from the road. She dug the spring out properly, lining it with field stones, creating a deep, clear pool that refilled as quickly as she could bucket the water out. She had water, abundant, limitless water, on land everyone had known was bone dry. The arithmetic had changed forever. She was no longer a woman on the edge of ruin. She was, she realized with a shock, becoming a woman of means. The Hogs grew fat and happy. The garden she planted in the rich, overturned soil of the basin exploded with life. She was not just surviving, she was thriving, in secret, on her hill of fools. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue, and the sun beat down with a physical weight. The rains, which had been sparse in the spring, stopped completely. The prairie grass cured to the color of old straw. The creek that fed the town of Prosperity shrank from a lively stream to a string of stagnant, muddy pools. A deep, collective anxiety began to settle over the valley. Farmers watched the sky, their faces etched with worry. Corn leaves twisted into tight, desperate spikes. The dust from the fields rose in hazy clouds that never seemed to settle. On Elspeth's hill, however, a quiet miracle was unfolding. Her spring, fed from some deep, untouchable aquifer, showed no sign of faltering. The pool remained full, cool, and clear. While the valley below baked and withered, her garden, watered daily, was an oasis of defiant green. Her hogs, with constant access to water and mud, wallowed in blissful ignorance of the drought that was strangling the world around them. The contrast was so stark it felt like a different season. From the road, travelers could see the impossible green of her squash vines cresting the ridge, a sight so out of place it caused them to stop and stare. The whispers started then. The town's mockery, which had faded into a kind of grudging indifference, began to curdle into a new, more dangerous emotion: suspicion. How could the widow's worthless land be thriving when the best bottomland farms were burning up? What trick was she using? Silas Thorne heard the whispers, and his professional curiosity was piqued. He rode out one afternoon, his fine horse picking its way delicately up the rutted lane. He found Elspeth weeding her garden, the very picture of rustic success. "Good day, widow," he said, his voice dripping with his trademark false warmth. He surveyed the lush growth, the fat, sleeping hogs in the shade. "It seems your investment has paid off. The town is quite amazed." "The land is better than people thought," Elspeth said, not stopping her work. Her hands were steady. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Thorne's eyes narrowed, scanning the property. They lingered on the dense wall of vines that shielded the basin from view. He could hear the low, happy grunts of the hogs from behind it. He could almost smell the dampness in the air. "Indeed," he said slowly. "Remarkably better. My congratulations. A woman alone, accomplishing so much. It's an inspiration." The words were complimentary, but the tone was laced with something else. It was the sound of a man calculating, reassessing the value of something he had once dismissed. He knew the land. He knew there was no well on this property. The cistern by the cabin was nearly dry. He could see that from where he sat. So where was the water coming from? He smiled again, a predator's smile. "If you ever consider selling, you know who to come to. A property like this, with its surprising fertility, might fetch a fair price. I could see you move to a more comfortable place in town. It must be difficult, all this work." "I am not selling," Elspeth said. It was a simple statement of fact. Thorne's smile did not falter. "Of course. Well, the offer stands." He tipped his hat and rode away, but Elspeth felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. He had not been paying a social call. He had been prospecting. The secret of the spring was a weight in her gut. It was her salvation, but she now understood it could also be her peril. The world was beginning to turn its thirsty gaze in her direction. By September, the drought had tightened its grip into a stranglehold. The town creek was gone, a cracked, sun-baked scar on the landscape. One by one, the shallow wells in town began to fail. Then the deeper farm wells started to go. The sound of a pump handle squeaking in vain became a sound of dread. Panic, a low, simmering thing for weeks, began to boil over. Cattle, their ribs showing, were sold off for pennies on the dollar to drovers who had the means to move them to greener pastures. Old feuds between neighbors over water rights flared into open hostility. The town of prosperity was tearing itself apart at the seams. Hunger changes a town. Thirst changes it faster. Silas Thorne began his campaign in earnest. He started with offers. He sent a man to Elspeth with a written proposal to buy her land for twice what she had paid. She sent the man back with a simple, verbal no. A week later, another offer arrived, this one for 3 times the price. It too was refused. Thorne's methods then shifted. He began to sow poison. He spoke in the general store, his voice filled with feigned concern about the strangeness of the widow's luck. He wondered aloud if she was diverting water that rightfully belonged to the town's aquifer, if her unnatural abundance was somehow causing the wells below to fail. It was a baseless accusation, born of ignorance and greed, but in the desperate, fearful atmosphere of the drought, it found fertile ground. People began to look at Elspeth not with suspicion, but with resentment. Her green garden became an affront, her healthy hogs an insult to their own suffering. She was no longer a fool, she was a hoarder, a witch who kept her good fortune to herself while her neighbors withered. She felt the change in the way people turned their faces away when she came to town for supplies, the way they fell silent when she entered a room. The isolation she had felt in the beginning returned, but this time it was colder, sharper, edged with menace. One evening, Thorn came himself. He did not ride up the lane, but left his horse at the road and walked, as if to present himself as a humble petitioner. "Elspeth," he said, foregoing any honorifics, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk. The town is in crisis. People are suffering. Their wells are dry. Their cattle are dying." "I know," she said, standing on her porch, her arms crossed. She would not invite him in. "I have a solution," he went on, stepping closer. "A way for you to help your neighbors and secure your own future. Sell me the land. I will develop the water source, whatever it is you've found, and manage it for the good of the community. I'll pay you 5 times what you paid for it. A fortune. You'll be a hero." His eyes gleamed with a righteous fire that she knew was utterly false. He didn't want to save the community. He wanted to own its salvation. "The land is not for sale, Mr. Thorn." His face hardened, the mask of concern dropping away to reveal the cold calculus beneath. "You are being selfish and foolish. You cannot manage a resource like that on your own, a woman alone. The town council is meeting tomorrow. They will be discussing measures to ensure a fair distribution of all available water in this crisis. All available water. Do you understand what that means? They could condemn the property, seize it under emergency powers. You would be left with nothing. My offer is your only way out." It was a threat, plain and simple. He was using the town's desperation as a weapon against her. She looked past him, at the hazy, dust-choked valley below, and she felt the weight of her choice. The secret she had guarded so fiercely was about to be dragged into the light. A few days later, a drover named Marcus Kane came through, pushing a herd of skeletal longhorns north. He was a hard man, with a sun-scorched face and desperate eyes. His herd was half dead from thirst, and he had been told there was no water for 50 miles. He had been about to give up and sell the herd for salvage when someone in town, with a sneer, told him to try the widow with the magic pigs. He rode up to Elspeth's gate, prepared to beg, barter, or threaten for a barrel of water. What he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't just the garden, it was the hogs. 80 of them, fat, sleek, and glistening with health, dozed in the shade or rooted contentedly in the damp earth. In a land where every other living thing was shrinking and dying, Elspeth's hogs were the picture of porcine perfection. He had never seen such fine animals, not even in a good year. "Ma'am," he said, swinging down from his horse and taking off his hat. The word was filled with a respect that had been absent from the voices of her neighbors for months. "They told me you had water. They didn't tell me you were a miracle worker." Elspeth looked at the man, at his exhausted face, and at the suffering animals behind him. She saw not a threat, but a fellow traveler on the hard road of survival. "My hogs found a spring," she said simply. "I have water." Relief washed over the man's face so powerfully he seemed to sway. "Can I buy some? Ma'am, I'll pay anything. Just enough to get my herd to the next river." She looked at his thirsty cattle and then back at her own thriving animals. The arithmetic was different now. It was no longer about her own survival, but about what she owed to the world. "There is a fair price for labor," she said, her voice steady, "and there is a price for desperation. I only charge for the labor. 10 cents a barrel. You draw it yourself." The drover stared at her. 10 cents a barrel was practically free. He could have been charged $1, $5, and he would have paid it gladly. Her generosity stunned him into silence. He and his men spent the rest of the day hauling bucket after bucket from the stone-lined pool, filling their barrels, letting their cattle drink their fill. As the sun set, Cain came to the porch to settle his debt. He counted out the coins into her hand. Then he looked at her hogs. "Those are the finest pigs I've seen in 10 years," he said. "I'm heading to the mining camps up north. They pay top dollar for good pork. I'll give you $10 a head for 20 of them. Cash money, right now." Elspeth did the math in her head. $200. It was a staggering sum, more money than she had ever seen in one place. It was vindication. It was security. It was proof, in the only language men like Silas Thorne understood, that what she had done here was not foolishness. It was a masterstroke. "I'll sell you 10, she said. "I need to keep a breeding stock." The deal was struck. The drover paid her, and his men cut 10 fat hogs from the herd. The news of the transaction traveled faster than a prairie fire. A drover had paid cash for the widow's half-dead pigs. He had paid a premium price, and he had watered his entire herd from a spring on her land. The town's resentment was now mixed with a feverish greed. The secret was out. Elspeth's land was not a waste. It was the key to the entire valley's survival, and Silas Thorne knew he had to have it. The next morning, they came. Silas Thorne led the procession, his face set in a mask of grim civic duty. Behind him were the 3 members of the town council, men Elspeth knew to be in Thorne's pocket, and behind them a silent, grim-faced crowd of townsfolk. They carried buckets and barrels. They were not coming to ask. They were coming to take. Elspeth met them at the fence line, Finn standing just behind her, a small, defiant shadow. Mrs. Petrova was there too, having appeared from the woods as if summoned by the crisis itself. She stood off to the side, a silent, watchful witness. "Elspeth," Thorne began, his voice ringing with false authority. "The council has declared a state of emergency. By ordinance, all private water sources are to be placed under public stewardship to ensure the survival of the community. We are here to take control of your spring." "This is my land, Mr. Thorne," Elspeth said, her voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "The spring is on my land. A single person cannot be allowed to hoard a resource the entire town needs to live," one of the councilmen blustered. "It's for the greater good." The crowd murmured in agreement. Their faces were hard with thirst and envy. They saw her as the obstacle between them and life-giving water. Thorne smiled, sensing his victory. "The law is on our side. Now, stand aside. We have no wish to cause you trouble." He moved to open the gate. It was in that moment that Elspeth realized her mistake. She had banked her secret like a coal, but she had forgotten that a banked coal gives no light. She had protected her abundance so fiercely that she had made herself look like a miser. She had let Thorne tell her story for her. Now she had to tell it herself. "Wait," she said. Her voice was stronger now. All eyes turned to her. "You say I am hoarding water. You say I am one person alone, thinking only of myself." She looked past Thorne, at the faces in the crowd. She saw her neighbors. She saw Mr. Gable, whose wife had helped deliver her. She saw Mrs. Jensen, who had given her a jar of peaches after her husband died. She saw the fear and desperation in their eyes, and she saw how Thorne was using it. "How did you know the Count?" she asked, her gaze locking with Thorne's. He blinked. "The Count? What Count?" "The Hog Count," she said, her voice like ice. "When the drover bought my hogs yesterday, he bought 10. I still have 70. You told the council I was a hoarder, that I was unwilling to part with my assets to help the community. But everyone knows I sold him 10. How did you know the final count was 70 unless you were spying on my land, planning to take it all for yourself?" A flicker of panic crossed Thorne's face. He had overplayed his hand. He had been seen watching her property from the ridges, his greed making him careless. A few people in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Thorne blustered. "That's absurd. The point is the water." "The point is the price," Elspeth shot back, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. You don't want to manage the water for the town. You want to own it. You want to sell it back to them. You want to do to them with water what you do with land and loans. You want to put a meter on salvation. She turned her back on him, addressing the crowd directly. My spring is not for sale. My land is not for sale, but my water is not being hoarded. She took a deep breath. This was the moment, the moral choice. She could gouge them. She could charge them what the drover would have paid, what Thorn intended to charge. She could make herself rich on their misery, or she could do something else. The water is available to every family in this valley, she declared. 1 barrel per family per day. The price is 5 cents a barrel. That is the price for my labor to maintain the well, and Finn's labor to help manage the line. It is not the price of water. The water is a gift from the land. I will not sell a gift. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. 5 cents a barrel. It was nothing. It was an act of shocking, unbelievable generosity. They had come expecting a fight, ready to resent her for her wealth, and she had offered them grace. They looked from her steady, determined face to Silas Thorn's, which was now mottled with fury and disbelief. They saw the truth of her words in his eyes. He was the hoarder. He was the one who saw their desperation as an opportunity for profit. The tide of public opinion, so carefully managed by Thorn, turned in an instant. It was a silent, powerful reversal. A man at the front of the crowd, a farmer whose well had been dry for a week, slowly took off his hat. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Another man nodded, then another. The hostility in their faces dissolved, replaced by shame, and then by a profound, humbling gratitude. Thorn saw his power evaporating in the hot morning sun. He had lost. He had been outwitted not by clever legal maneuvering, but by simple, stark decency. "This is illegal," he sputtered. "The council has voted." "The council can vote again," a voice said. It was Mr. Gable, the town's blacksmith, and a man of considerable influence. He stepped forward from the crowd. "I think we've been listening to the wrong advice. The ordinance is rescinded. The widow's terms are more than fair. They are a blessing." The other councilmen, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quickly mumbled their agreement, unwilling to be on the wrong side of a grateful town. Defeated, Thorn turned without another word, pushed through the crowd that now parted for him with contempt, and strode away, his righteous crusade exposed as a common land grab. He was a man who had understood the arithmetic of money, but had never learned the first thing about the economy of community. As the people began to form an orderly line, their buckets ready, Anya Petrova came and stood beside Elspeth. She put a hand on her arm. "The land knows its own business," she whispered, her eyes twinkling. "And today it spoke very, very loudly." Elspeth looked at the line of her neighbors, at the children splashing their hands in the overflow from the horse trough, at Finn standing tall and proud, directing traffic like a little general. She looked at the green vines and the fat, sleeping hogs who had started it all. She had paid $25 for 80 starving animals and been mocked for it. They, in turn, had rooted up a cold spring the drought never touched, and with that spring she had bought something far more valuable than land or money. She had bought her place. She was no longer the widow, the fool, the outsider. She was Elspeth, the woman who had listened to the land, the woman who had brought water to prosperity. She was a woman alone, and she had saved them all.